A real utopia has utopian characteristics, of course. It refers to some kind of political economy or a policy package or a policy design that has utopian features. But the word real is supposed to remind us that, it's not from science fiction. We're talking about an institutional arrangement that exists in parts in various parts of the world or in various historical times. And so we looked at the Scandinavian model, though, and we said it seemed very clear to us that the only end result that would fit the bill of a real utopia were equal shares that were non-transferable and very highly paid. So that was really the picture. I think it's important to note that this model doesn't exist anywhere yet. The Scandinavian countries have a piece of this in place, as you know. The shareable components are still the majority, and the shareable components we've really found that the research showed were problematic. Then the question is how long. That is an empirical question you really have to ask. What are the impacts? As I have argued, I think the research tells me something in the range of 6 months. I could certainly be impressed with 4 or 8, but we don't want to be talking about leaves that are way too short, that they're inadequate, or I think we wouldn't imagine the ideal system would give each parent, say, 3 years, because it would be so destructive of their connection to the labor market. But of course, the European model has been much more that the allocation is given to the family. They used to be fully shareable, and the idea behind that, in fact, was quite optimistic, that people were much too optimistic about gender equality, and the idea was we would maximize choice, and most of us like to value choice and flexibility, so the idea was you give it to the couple. In some cases he'll take all, in some cases she'll take all. It'll come out, as we say, in the wash. But of course it didn't come out in the wash, and a lot of people sort of stepped back 20 years after some of these policies became widespread and said, this is really problematic. Men's and women's behavior is way too different, and anything that's shareable is being taken by her. Some of that is because of social pressure, and some of that is because of the reality of economics, that it makes sense for the lower earner to step out of the labor market. So now, of course, the system that everyone is so impressed by and looking at and we're sort of all peering at is the Icelandic system, which is now a 3, 3, and 3, as many people know, very impressive design. 3 months for her, essentially 3 months for him, and 3 months shareable. And the research has shown, at the last numbers that I saw, about 88% of men take the full 3 months. The change happened almost overnight, which we also saw in Sweden and Norway. The take-up of the non-transferable piece among men goes up instantly. I mean instantly, the minute that it's put in place, and the take-up is very high. And yet I'm going to tell the parallel story, which I think is slightly disappointing, about the shareable component. The last statistic I saw was also that over 90% of the shareable component is taken by women. And so it's exactly following the pattern, that we knew. And I do often say this when I speak. I'm always careful to indicate that I'm not a policy determinist. I don't think you push a switch and people respond. We're not exactly like like rats in the cage. However, it's the case that if there were ever a policy in the world where we see immediate and dramatic behavioral responses, it's non-transferable leave. We've seen it in many countries. The men's behavior in Iceland changed radically and overnight. The statistic I've heard about Norway was as soon as the user-lose was put in, men's take-up of that user-lose component, which, remember, they had the right to in the shareable system. So it's not as if it's an entirely new right. It's standing the incentive structure on its head by making it non-transferable. Men's take-up went up by a factor of 17 is the number that I've seen, almost overnight. Why not take this one step further? This is not the final design. This is really problematic, and we think we're in Sweden or Norway or Iceland, but the fact is this very gender inegalitarian incentive structure remains that really contaminates this entire structure. And the answer is almost always the same, which is that we began with this earlier system that had a shareable, transferable framework. It's very difficult to take it away. And the fact of the matter is, it's often women who resist.